This is a radio broadcast addressed from the League of Nations on the global war effort against the Morgana threat, where we report the recent happenings amongst the major nations contributing to the defense of our united front. I am your speaker, Ammaraglio Maus, but you may refer to me as Commissar, or simply the Speaker, whichever you or your government prefers. It's now the 4th week of January, and most nations of the world seem to be realigning their focus on the Morgana threat, as large Morgana fleets in the Alboran Sea and the Strait of Tartary were routed in their entirety, thanks to proper coordination and hard yet swift blows. Despite that, however, diplomatic tensions continue to heighten as nations wage war with words, pen, and paper, vying for control and/or security for themselves. Though for some, struggle comes from within, as military and political faction members clash over doctrine and principles. First up, news from the League itself. After much deliberation, members from the League of Nations voted to assist Norway by providing an international defense force for the new INPF base of Narvik. It was initially hoped after the vote that the United States would provide the bulk of the protection force, but the newly arrived U.S. representatives were quick to dispel the idea. The presence of the United States in the League of Nations was still unpopular with a lot of folks back home. Sending American troops to Europe just weeks after the decision would likely be too unsettling, said one of the representatives. Given this disappointing news, Norway expressed concerns about the proposal by France and Britain to provide reinforced brigade-level contingents. Such a significant presence by the Allies made Norway and Sweden anxious. The Nordic nations wished to stay neutral in the war between the Allies and Germany, and thousands of Allied troops in Narvik would greatly complicate this, not to mention questions of sovereignty. A working team was formed, resulting in an invitation for any member nation to send a contingent no larger than a standard company total. It was hoped that dozens of nations would each send a contingent, and that they'd work together with the Norwegian army to perform their duties for all of humanity. Following that comes news from the Allied powers, of which Britain and France submitted a joint request to Sweden for the use of their rails to transport supplies and arms from Narvik to Finland. Several Swedish legislators noted that this request came at nearly the same time as proposals from the same nations to station brigade-level forces in Narvik. The Swedish government took the Allied request under advisement, but by week's end no response had been forthcoming. Following the update from the Allies comes news from Italy, the world's leading nation in combating the Morgana threat. Everything seemed to be coming up Italy this week, much to the delight of Mussolini, sources say, and nothing was more evident of this than the Balkan Neutrality Pact, which was shaping up more beautifully than anyone could have possibly anticipated. With the Allies throwing their own diplomatic pressure onto Yugoslavia, and on King Peter personally to accept the deal, it was clear to the Italian government that they only had to make one last firm diplomatic push. Il Duce personally went to Yugoslavia and applied pressure to King Peter directly, while throwing a citywide event for the local people just to highlight how good having Italy as a friend could be. It was the kind of spectacle that Mussolini lived for, and he soaked up the limelight afforded to him in Belgrade like a cat in a sunbeam. However, for all of Mussolini's over-the-top exuberance, and the Italian Foreign Service's firm pressure on the rest of Yugoslavia's government, where Italy offered an open hand and plenty of honey, Germany had a closed iron fist on Yugoslavia's border, and was making it very, very clear that they were not pleased at all with King Peter's potential alliance with this neutrality pact, nor were they pleased with Mussolini and the Italians' distance from them. As the contest for Yugoslavia's future comes to its climax, those in the know were sure of one thing: Hitler would remember this. Yugoslavia wasn't the only victory to be found for the Italians. Weeks before, Italy had promised to drive despair out of the Alboran Sea, and while the Italian Foreign Ministry waged war with pen and paper, the Regia Marina decided it was finally time to make good on that promise. South of Sardegna, the Regia Marina rallied the bulk of its strength, readying to steam westward. With their forces in place, it now came down to finding despair. Despair was wily, if unpredictable prey, and sending a full squadron of destroyers to seek her out might tip the Regia Marina's hand and allow despair to escape before they can bring forward their full might. It was then decided to split a squadron of destroyers into pairs before sending them into the Alboran Sea. Escorts going out to meet convoys were normal enough, after all, as were small patrols, so it would draw less attention overall. The major downside is that splitting the scouting force would create larger holes in the net that they were casting. However, an intelligence officer had a cunning two-part plan to solve that issue. For the first part, they got in touch with Allied and neutral merchantmen, escorted or not, any and all convoys coming through the Strait of Gibraltar. They even tuned into French weather reports and any bit of signal intelligence they could get their hands on. With all eyes in the Alboran turned into their eyes, naval intelligence got enough contact reports to build a picture of the situation in the Alboran Sea, and the Regia Aeronautica was directed to send out long-range scout aircraft to verify everything they've heard. Finally, 3 hours after the scouting portion of the operation began, the Regia Marina had nailed down a particularly dense patch of fog with regular Morgana activity coming in and out, some 185 kilometers south of the Costa del Sol. A destroyer pair that got close picked up massive amounts of radio traffic from the patch, most of it from Despair with her usual blend of morose nonsense. There could be no doubt. They found Despair's nest. And so began the second part of the intelligence operation against Despair. A small group of volunteers with an extremely powerful radio set tuned into Despair's frequency and began to respond, arguing with her in what quickly became a furious debate in 6 languages, plus the occasional bit of unintelligible screeching from the Sea Witch herself. Soon her despair gave way to anger in the face of the consistent message of hope and courage broadcasted by the Italians. Reports state that half of the 10 volunteers would need to be hospitalized from Despair's constant spikes of fear and depression scrambling their minds, but they did their duty. As one wore out, the next stepped forward, and they accomplished their mission. They had Despair's full and undivided attention. She was right where the Regia Marina wanted her. The Regia Marina made for the fog at full steam. Instead of shying away from the dangerous purple mists, the experienced crews battened down the hatches, trusted in their barrels, and on the signal from RN Conte di Cavour, acting as flagship, went to flank speed right as the first vessels crossed into the purple clouds, making a lightning dash deep into the fog and catching Despair completely off guard. Not that a surprised Morgana isn't dangerous, of course, but they still take time to respond, time to react, time to train their guns, and heavy salvos from the Italian battleships were hammering into her hull long before Despair could formulate any semblance of a response. A daring group of destroyers led by the cruiser RN Duca d'Aosta ducked in close and made a torpedo attack on Despair and her consorts, snapping the keel of us in before she could launch anything but her fighters, and doing a variety of damage to other vessels in Despair's group. The flotilla paid for their courage, however, taking a few body blows across their group from some of the heavier Morgana units, before they themselves took furious fire from RN Conte di Cavour and her battleships in return. No ships were sunk, but d'Aosta and the others took casualties and middling damage before making good on their escape to reload their torpedoes for another attack run. By the time they were ready to rejoin the battle, however, it was already over. The battleships and their escorts closed in with a furious zeal, as if Despair was the much-hated and reviled Vanity herself, and laid waste to Despair's formation. Like Roman ships of old, RN Duilio charged in and rammed the surface asphyxiation with her bow, cleaving her in twain before firing 3 full broadsides into Despair in such rapid succession some sailors thought the ship had developed a naval rifle cousin to the machine gun. Despair returned the favor, though, and RN Duilio took 3 heavy salvos in response before the rest of the battleships closed in and finished off Despair. Despair herself went down approximately 30 minutes after the opening shots of the engagement, sinking by the stern as her superstructure burned. Despair herself was observed standing on the bow as her hull pitched upward and slid into the waves. Unlike many Morgana, she did not curse them. She did not rage and did not promise revenge. She simply watched the Italians maneuvering to finish off her battle group before finally vanishing as her hull disappeared into the depths. It had been unspoken, but those who had seen her knew she would be back, and that she would not forget this. With the death of Despair, the fog started to fade, and the last stragglers of the battle group were mopped up under blue skies. Victorious, triumphant, and with the Alboran Sea free of despair, the Regia Marina's fleet formed up and made for their home ports. Just over a dozen ships remained behind. RN Duca d'Aosta and RN Duilio made for Gibraltar under escort. Their damage was not fatal, but severe enough to merit caution, and perhaps it was a good opportunity to foster their new friendship with the British. Reports state the escort, led by RN Gorizia, with 2 light cruisers and a squadron of destroyers, would take up a patrol in the Alboran Sea until relieved. With a major blow struck against the Morgana in the Alboran Sea, Regia Marina High Command saw this as a favorable sign to continue with their plan to focus on controlling Morgana access to the Mediterranean via the Straits of Gibraltar during the run-up to the Vanity Conference. Many of the guests and delegates were going to be delayed permanently if the Regia Marina had anything to say about it. That, of course, led to questions about what the composition of that force should be. R.N. Goritsia's task force was of decent strength and speed, and could engage the enemy reasonably well if need be. 3 squadrons of a similar size put into a rotation with 1 on patrol, 1 on alert in Messina, and the other resting in Toronto would make for a good interdiction force, who could call in the battle fleet to drop the heavy end of the hammer on any Morgana that were too much for them. Other voices suggested splitting the battle force into 3 task groups, each based on a battleship once R.N. Duilia was back in action with reinforcements from the Messina force. Still, others suggested keeping the heavy cruisers and battleships concentrated, and putting out scouting flotillas consisting of a destroyer squadron and 2 or 3 light cruisers. They could interdict light Morgana elements, engage via torpedo as needed, and with their speed cover more ocean than groups led by slower vessels. When heavier Morgana fleet units showed, and they would show, these scouting groups could then call in the battle force as with the original suggestion. While the debate of how to fully implement their plan to defend the Mediterranean was in full swing, few had yet thought to ask what the Royal Navy would have to say about their new guests. Assisting with escorts of English coal was one thing, but having decent-sized Italian fleet units nearby constantly was another question entirely. A question that would likely have to be answered sooner rather than later. The Regia Marina's pivot west couldn't have come soon enough, however. On the night of the 21st, the Italian steamer Orazio exploded 75 kilometers south of Toulon. It's unclear if the Orazio fell prey to a Morgana attack or if there was some sort of internal failure. Due to Morgana activity in the region, the only ship that dared to assist was the French destroyer Kherson. Reports of the incident state that she only managed to recover 106 of the 688 people who had shipped aboard the Orazio. While no one was quite sure what happened to the Orazio, it was clear to Regia Marina planners that something was almost certainly afoot in the west. They'd have to investigate as part of their new focus in the region, and possibly reach out to the Marine Nationale with thanks for the rescue of what people Kherson could reach from Orazio's passengers and crew, and perhaps consider future collaboration in protecting civilian shipping in the region. It was something to think about, at least. Following that comes news from France, the second leading member contributing to our united front, and whose recent efforts might overtake Italy's own. With the Marine Nationale recovering from the First Battle of Helgoland and dedicating their focus to the new Allied bellification program, France also sought to intensify the shipbuilding industry on top of that, and perhaps one lonely voice offered to help. To inaugurate her new relationship with France, the Morgana Mischief offered to complete and improve the currently under construction battleship Jean Bart. In its current state, it was not of much use, and she could make it even more effective, she promised. The Marine Nationale gladly accepted the help, in the face of the menace that might become the German invasion. French military command was confident that the mighty Maginot Line would hold against any and all attacks, especially now that they had the German plans for the attack itself. But if the Kriegsmarine tried something uncanny, or the opportunity for shore bombardment arose, it was better to have her than not, though what would become of Jean Bart was at this point unclear. There was also hope that something useful for the Army de Terre would come from it, so why not, said one French politician, who followed that up by saying, quote, Mischief's broadcast actually proved to be funny and entertaining. Most of the time she was on air, she sang mocking songs, and sometimes told listeners secrets about famous people, which surely were all made up, of course. But it was also late at night, so few would listen to her anyways, end quote. In other news, following intel from P.C. Bruno, the Marine Nationale was convinced that the Morgana Paranoia was almost alone, but in possession of some kind of super-weapon. With the British team being nearby, time was of the essence, so a small squadron of 5 destroyers was dispatched into the area. Vautour, Cassat, Tramontane, Toinade, and Fougu sailed out to retrieve the weapon at full speed, but worryingly, nothing has been heard of them since. More action close to home was had by the destroyer Kherson. In the middle of the night, the Italian steamer Orazio had signaled SOS, and due to Morgana activity, only Kherson dared to get close. Bracing for a trap, the crew found a burning ship and saved who they could, but despite their best efforts, only saved 106 souls. Some of the ship's watch swore they saw shadows under the water, dragging people down. Others swore they had made out the conning tower of a German U-boat in the night, but did not open fire out of fear of hitting people in the water. Whatever the truth was, it made the Marine Nationale aware that even the Regia Marina couldn't be everywhere at once. After that comes news from the Empire of Japan, who are the third contributing nation to our united front against the Morgana. News from the Pacific this week focused almost exclusively on the reports of a joint Japanese-Soviet operation to smash the chain of the Tartary Straits once and for all. The Japanese combined fleet sortied north, and the Soviet Pacific Fleet came out of their defensive positions up the Amur River and made a pincer attack against the chains and the heavy Morgana defenders. Morgana shore installations had been built up significantly since the previous Soviet attempt to break the chain weeks prior, and what had been one chain was now several. With this divider between them, the Soviet forces quickly found themselves in trouble and under heavy Morgana assault, losing the Urugan-class guard boats Vyuga and Buran under furious fire from a Morgana battle group led by a black-haired cowardice, who seemed to delight in butchering as many of the smaller combat vessels of the Soviet Pacific Fleet as she could get her guns on, or even just running through them with her bow, while the other elements of their battle group turned to fight the larger Soviet combatants. To say things were not looking good for the Soviet Pacific Fleet was a massive understatement, and all could have been lost without the decisive action of the 5th Sentai under IJN Ashigara and 4th Sentai under IJN Takao, with 2 destroyer divisions following their lead. They had been sent to flank the enemy from the north via the Soyuz Strait, and made a risky dash through the Sea of Okhotsk under the cover of darkness that went better than expected, bypassing Morgana defenses and leaving them in a good position to assault the chains of the Strait of Tartary from its northern mouth. With a ferocious howl that reports said could be heard back from the northern coast of Japan, the hungry wolf cut the chains before her with her sword and precision gunfire as she led the charge with a Z flag hoisted high for all to see, determined to relieve the Soviets, bringing the assaulting Morgana forces to close quarters battle before the Morgana realized that Imperial Japanese Navy forces were even upon them. Ashigara herself delivered vengeance for the fallen Soviet ships and their crews, practically ramming Cowardice so she could board her, then gutting Cowardice's avatar in what would later be described by a foreign observer aboard IJN Arago as, quote, a staggering display of brutality and sheer fury, end quote. Ashigara fought Cowardice for what felt like hours, but consisted solely of a few minutes of furious personal combat as the ship-to-ship melee went on around them, before she appeared on Cowardice's bow and hoisted her bloodied sword and Cowardice's head high into the air to ensure as many of the Red Fleet sailors and ships could see it, rallying them to help their Japanese counterparts utterly crush the Northern Morgana battle group. With the northern threat dispatched and the Soviets rescued, 4th and 5th Sentai would then reform their group, now spearheading along the remaining Red Fleet units and performing a massive long-range torpedo attack into the aft flank of the Southern Morgana battle group, not only striking numerous vessels and allowing the primary force of the combined fleet, led by IJN Mutsu, IJN Fuso, and IJN Yamashiro, to defeat the enemy in detail, but also unintentionally slamming numerous long-lance torpedoes into a previously unseen underwater structure and destroying it completely in a torrent of water and strange lights that reached 100 feet into the air before the water finally began to settle. With the chains cut and the enemy burning, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, observing from IJN Mutsu's flag bridge, ordered all ships to allow no Morgana forces to escape, and to purge all Morgana facilities ashore with naval gunfire. The Admiral's order was enthusiastically carried out by the men and women of the Combined Fleet. Japanese naval aviation, represented by IJN Akagi, with IJN Hiryo and IJN Hosho in support, would lead this stage of the battle. The process of systematically hunting down every single Morgana vessel in the area and destroying their shore facilities throughout the region took hours, well into the late afternoon as bombs and shells rained from seemingly every direction possible at once on the Morgana facilities. A combined naval task force and massive airstrikes from ship and shore-based naval aviation destroyed the last Morgana seaborne platform as the sun started to set. After which the Japanese ships split from the Soviets, formed up and steamed for Maizuru, Kure, and Yokohama respectively. To commemorate their momentous victory, when the ships returned to port the following day, they were greeted by imperial envoys who had brought specially made tantos for each belle, their captains, and sacred sake for the junior officers and sailors, that they might toast their victory and honor their dead. Following the great battle of Sakhalin, the people of Japan were jubilant, and the emperor made his joy in the heroic efforts of the Imperial Japanese Navy known to all from his palace in Tokyo in a far more public way than the gifts he had sent to the docks. His Imperial Majesty declared a new religious holiday to offer worship and respect to the kami of the fleet, with seemingly ever more religious focus placed on the kami of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Some observers within the Navy Ministry noted there would likely come some sort of reckoning with the actual institutions of state Shinto about their kami, and that reckoning would likely come sooner rather than later. With such tremendous news in the north, the news that the new Chinese government would be receiving a pair of Ninghai-class light cruisers to form the backbone of their new navy, as well as patrol and customs craft, went relatively unnoticed outside of China itself. Within China, however, the news was met with mixed reactions. It was a sign of confidence in and the strength of Wang Jingwei's government in Nanjing, and made many parties hopeful of a positive outcome for the ongoing negotiations, especially after the recent announcement that had some people thinking the Jingwei government might actually be a Chinese government by itself, and not just a Japanese puppet state. What this will mean for the ongoing negotiations to end the war, and for the Jingwei government, is unknown at this time, but some observers suggest Jingwei now has the firmer standing required to start courting warlords and disgruntled members of the Kuomintang. Perceptions from outside the Japanese sphere were cautious. Senior representatives of the United States, France, and Britain remained clear that it was up to the Japanese to nurture an equitable peace, and not the Chinese to surrender into it. Support for the Kuomintang would continue unabated for the time being. With tumultuous events, both local to South China Sea and in the rest of the empire, claiming the limelight, and ongoing developments regarding negotiations in mainland China taking up whatever's left, no one seemed to notice Commander Kai quietly going ashore from Aije and Nagato during a replenishment stop in Keelung, Formosa, with an escort of Togatai officers and a coterie of scientists. Kai retired to a prepared isolated building aboard the Japanese naval base, and it seemed that delusion would need to be dealt with. Following that, we head east over the Pacific to hear news from the United States, who are the fourth contributing member in our war against the Morgana. With the quiet support of the Navy and the War Department, and more overt support from the President, plans were put before Congress to increase income and corporate taxes to pay for war production. With less fanfare, a program of voluntary war bonds was to be instituted to help the United States government pay for what was clearly going to be a long and costly war against an implacable enemy. With the homeland under serious threat for the first time since the early 19th century, total economic mobilization wasn't just desirable, it seemed deeply necessary. Meanwhile, in Norfolk, the Naval and Military Construction Battalions, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, the Seabees, and a select civilian contractors broke ground on what was likely the greatest fortification project since the construction of the Maginot Line a few decades earlier. Norfolk Naval Yard was going to be the heart of American and quite possibly global Morgana research, and as such it needed protections and security on a scale that rivaled the greatest fortresses in human history. With extensive support from more defensively minded American belles, and a blank check from the President, a great series of bunkers, walls, and outright fortresses would be produced. It was also stated that the Department of the Navy would press unused or leftover battleship turrets into service as coastal defense weapons for use by the U.S. Army Coastal Defense Forces. Utilizing weapons replaced on ships during upgrade as well, yet more weapons would be added to what promises to be a forest of naval rifles of all calibers, and the single greatest concentration of anti-aircraft weapons of all sizes in the known world. Furthermore, mines would be laid, submarine nets that were thought to be able to beat back even the likes of massive asphyxiation were to be prepared. Every angle of warfare through which the Morgana could attack Norfolk or up the Chesapeake was considered by the War Department and Navy planners. And slowly, civilians from Norfolk were relocated outside of the city to far safer locations as Norfolk's surrounding regions were placed under strict martial law. There would be no repeat of the kind of attack by subverted Morgana agents that claimed the USS Constitution. Within the naval yard, still more work was underway, as newly enclosed dry docks were constructed, nestled in close with support buildings to contain laboratories, staff canteens, and even barracks for the personnel stationed at the research post to sleep in, if need be. All to be nestled within their own set of sturdy reinforced concrete walls and defensive fortifications, along with enough anti-aircraft firepower to arm a modern heavy cruiser, as a last line of defense against Morgana aircraft. Sources say that CB petty officers did notice one disquieting detail while considering the plans, however. All of the major gun emplacements could be reorientated to fire on the city itself, and more specifically the planned facilities that would house the various elements of Morgana technology being researched. The men agreed this was a sensible choice, but it gave them a chill down their spines regardless. It also made them reconsider the inner defenses around the research post. Were those walls, guard towers, and bunkers to keep people out or in? The more experienced chief petty officers, looking at the possible firing lines, figured it was both. And the thought of that too likely sent chills down the spines of even the most experienced CBs present. Following that comes news from our comrades in the North, the Soviet Union, who are the 5th contributing member to our united front. This week, the Soviet Pacific Fleet sortied with the Dawn out of the mouth of the Amur. The plan they shared with the Japanese High Command was ambitious, but the Soviets were confident they could kick things off and open the door for their co-belligerents to do the heavy lifting, much as it galled the Pacific Fleet senior officers to admit they needed the Imperial Japanese Navy support to do anything. But they had to be realistic. Unfortunately, their plan had been anticipated by the enemy, and the Red Fleet sailed square into an ambush led by a distinctly unique cowardice in a battle group. They were hemmed in on all sides, not just by enemy ships, but an entire web of chains to boot. With little room to maneuver and a battle cruiser literally on top of them, any hope of an orderly engagement turned into a close-quarters brawl, and then a straight-up bloodbath as smaller boats were taken out left, right, and center, with the survivors doing their best to rally on Voikov and the pair of Genevies that were some of the heaviest Soviet ships present at the battle. In what felt like hours, but in reality was just minutes of fighting, every ship with torpedoes had expended their tubes, and some very brave sailors were doing their best to reload said tubes under fire. However, many of them would not survive the heroic attempts to give their ships a fighting chance. As survivors put it, many were gleefully cut down by a particularly sadistic murder with pinpoint, small arms fire from our anti-aircraft guns. Some of the more dramatic men would say the sea was turning red with blood, but really, the dark blue waters of the straits were unchanged, seemingly cold and indifferent to what was rapidly turning into the last stand of the Soviet Pacific Fleet. Seeing the writing on the walls, Voikov took command, doing her best to cajole and organize her ships into a tighter formation to allow some smaller vessels to flee back to the Amur, and to cover some of the Uragan-class patrol boats so they too could fall back and reload their torpedoes. Upon successfully reloading, Metal took the lead and organized her sisters, quickly bringing the guard ships up to their full, if limited, speed, and made what ended up being a suicidal close-quarters torpedo attack on the murder that had butchered so many Red Fleet sailors just moments before. A full spread of every torpedo the Urugans had left returned the favor, snapping Murder's keel in 4 places, subsequently collapsing her into pieces. The shattered wreckage sank less than a minute later. A brilliant success, but the Urugans paid dearly for it. Of the 4 who made the run on Murder, 2 were sunk outright. Vuga and Biran both sunk, one by ramming, with all hands. Metal and Grom took moderate damage before managing to fall back to the rest of the Pacific Fleet, with Metal performing some very aggressive maneuvers that strained her engines to the absolute limit, and with the Urugan's low freeboard left her practically underwater as she cut through the waves, drawing fire off the more damaged Grom. 2 of the Genevies moved forward to cover the Urugan flotilla's withdrawal, and they took the brunt of Cowardice's anger once Vuga and Biran were lost, with one destroyer taking a direct hit to her torpedo launchers, and her sister ship's depth charges detonating on deck, setting the stricken vessel ablaze as they pulled back under heavy fire from the Morgana. Both would have likely been lost without Voikov's further interdiction, drawing fire from the Genevies before falling back herself, landing precision shots on every Morgana that came into the arc of her weapons before reforming with the rest of the fleet. The death of Murdo was one positive note in what looked to be a very dark day for the Soviet Navy. As the Morgana closed in, though, they could hear the distant sound of battleship-caliber guns. The Japanese were coming, but many knew the Japanese would almost certainly be too late. There was too much of the strait to cover, too many chains to break, and the main body of the Morgana ships to fight through before the Japanese could relieve them. Even a last-minute torpedo salvo from some of the Pacific Fleet's submarines only bought them few precious moments of respite as Morgana destroyers moved off to engage the Soviet submarines. At the last minute, however, when everything seemed at its darkest, a blood-curdling howl sounded over the water, and one of the chains vanished into the sea with a sharp sound of metal clashing against metal. Through the northern mouth of the straits, a fleet of Japanese warships came in at flank speed, cannons firing as fast as their gunners could load them. They were saved, and as Ashigar howled a triumph over their would-be killer, displaying cowardice's head for all to see, they also knew they'd have their revenge, and that was just as sweet a thought as surviving to see the sunset. At the end of the day, when the Soviet Pacific Fleet limped back to their moorings, it was clear that the butcher's bill was a heavy one. The loss of 2 Yurugin-class guard boats, which while modest compared to the other world's fleets, still represented a palpable amount of Soviet Pacific naval availability. The damage caused to more sizable ships by cowardice, specifically the pair of unfortunate Genevies, would further hamper Soviet possibilities in the area for a while. Along with that, sources say some survivors from the Pacific Fleet are referring to this day's battle as, quote, the day the tide rose red, in remembrance of those who bravely gave their lives. One bright spot from the battle would come in the following days, however. For their heroism and leadership, both Voykov and Middle are honored with the title of God, and several Pacific Fleet sailors and officers were decorated as well. 6 ordinary sailors were posthumously named Heroes of the Soviet Union, all of which had been killed by murder while attempting to reload torpedoes under fire. 20 other officers and sailors were told that they were to be decorated with the Order of the Red Banner, Order of the Red Star, or the Battle Merit and Valor Medals respectively. Whether those awards would actually survive the Soviet bureaucracy was another story entirely, but for the time, as the Pacific Fleet licked its wounds, it was a powerful boost to morale. Hope may not be a legitimate battle plan, but Soviet admirals and bell captains were left with little more than hope that the Morgana would look elsewhere for a while. Ideally, until the arrival of the first 2 Hipper-class cruisers expected in late summer. If the enemy focused attention on the Soviet Pacific coast between now and then, the Soviets would be in the humiliating position of depending on the Imperial Japanese Navy to solve their problems in Soviet home waters. Already, the populace of Vladivostok was restive, and those in the know and far-flung towns to the north and northeast prepared to flee inland if the Morgana attacked, as they knew help was likely not on the way. In other news, with the Baltic rapidly freezing after the destruction of the weather machine early in the month, the Soviet Baltic Fleet made one last effort to help bring the Winter War to a timely conclusion, with an eye less on helping the Red Army and more towards further engagement with the mysterious yet captivating FNS Vainamonen, following an amicable resolution of the human combat. Recognizing the importance of the forces in the Suma sector to maintaining the Finnish Mannerheim line, the Baltic Fleet ships took the risk of drawing close to shore during the night to make the most of their naval rifles and better coordinate with ground-based spotters and scouts who communicated the location of Finnish emplacements. While the Navy gunners achieved unexpected success against the Finnish land units in due part to the short range, the Finnish artillery displayed similarly unexpected accuracy, targeting unfamiliar and moving naval targets under the clear winter sky. As dawn approached, the wreckage of the destroyers' marks and angles lay on the seabed, but the Red Army was able to take the initiative to encircle and rout the Finnish forces across the Suma sector. By the end of the day, the Finns were scrambling to re-establish themselves along the intermediate line while limiting casualties. The brave Mannerheim defense was lost. Meanwhile, the Soviet Navy looked nervously to the south. Disease had not been completely purged from the Black Sea, and only constant vigilance by the Turkish ship Yavuz was fending off forays by vanity through the Dardanelles. Given the need for a crew to rest, it appeared inevitable that Yavuz's perfect score to date wouldn't last. The conventional defenses of Istanbul alone couldn't prevent transit through the strait. In the event of attacks on the city, ordnance would be focused on the Morgana that presented a direct threat in the moment. And if vanity wanted to sail through without approaching the city, discretion would likely be the better part of valor. Experience proved Ataturk would see to the needs of Turkey first and foremost. As the only major power in the Black Sea, and knowing Turkey would be hard-pressed to simply defend their own lengthy Anatolian coastline, especially if vanity broke through, Comrade Molotov and his staff pressed the leaders of Bulgaria and Romania to permit access to ports along the Black Sea coast to dissuade vanity, and to transit up the Danube as needed to prevent another disease infestation. Following that comes news from the United Kingdom, who are the sixth contributing nation to our united front against the Morgana. This week, at the behest of the recently passed war plan, and despite the displeasure of the locals, HMS Pembroke VII expanded the research project to the Seychelles. Dr. Miriam Vane and her crew of boffins bubbled over with ideas, some more workable than others. Whispers have come back to the Admiralty of their grand plans. Disassembling the German Morgana weather control technology is just the start. They plan to uncover the secrets of Morgana invisibility, unwind the process that lets Bells and Morgana teleport, and awaken Bells that are still asleep. A particularly ebullient young scientist even mentioned punching a hole into something, though he was quickly silenced by Dr. Vane herself. Dr. Vane has also informed the Admiralty that any experiments they might run are in the earliest stages, and that nothing might even come of them. But she reminded them that they'd had good results thus far. Experiments impossible in the United Kingdom were feasible here, even if they required the sacrifice of sleep or sanity. For the past week, every single resident of the Seychelles, native or foreign, has had the same nightmare, though the details were not provided when I further questioned Dr. Vane on the subject. However, Dr. Vane stated that she counts these among her results, but she's been remarkably closed-mouthed about what those results might be. I guess only time will tell. Meanwhile, Parliament and much of London were looking back towards their colonies, and it seemed that there was no compelling cause to make major changes in Indian economic and political policy, so London left well enough alone. The All India States People's Conference continued to decry the United Kingdom for unilaterally pulling India into the land war without agreeing to any of Congress's proposals for Indian independence, claiming that it pulled valuable resources away from protecting the Indian coast. Lord Linlithgow, the Viceroy of India, refused to comment. The Muslim League's leaders, including Muhammad Ali Jinnah, have been drafting a proposal, the contents of which are as yet unknown. And of final note, a report came in that destroyer HMS Grenville sank with no survivors. Presumably, she was somewhere in the North Sea when this occurred, but I've also received conflicting reports of her being in the Western Mediterranean. I've attempted to reach out to those in the Admiralty of the Royal Navy for more information, though nothing was disclosed. Regardless, the cause of her loss remains unclear. Lastly, but certainly not least, comes news from Germany, the seventh contributing nation in our war against the Morgana. With the installations on Helgoland gone and the embarrassing raid on Dune last week, some frustrated Kriegsmarine commanders have had enough. Whoever cooperated with the Morgana in Berlin had to be taught a lesson, and to set the record straight that the Kriegsmarine would not play along with their twisted games anymore. The forces gathered at Helgoland were joined on the 20th by the Nordse Flotte under the leadership of the flagship KMS Scharnhorst herself. The risk of running into the Royal Navy yet again was disregarded, and the lurking mistrust forces were hit with a sudden, surprising, and very successful frontal attack. The present mistrust force was sunk, and it was made sure she got the message to stay away from now on. Simultaneously, units of the Marine Troop Company raided several secret research labs inside Berlin, Danzig, and Rügen to seize all assets the Anna had collected to date. It was clear the Abwehr had also helped to strike a blow to the Schutzstaffel and their SD. The raid on Rügen was under the leadership of none other than my close friend Liebrecht Maus, who seemed to take special offense in all the acts carried out by the SS researchers. There, the Marine Troop Company got a hold on all results and materials with which the SS wanted to do things, some of which looked suspiciously off. Liebrecht then said she would take those if no one objected, and it seemed no one dared to object to the furious Belle. A safe call, as I know firsthand what she's capable of when in such a state, despite her usual rosy and modest temperament. In Berlin, a firefight ensued, which left several SS men dead and 2 members of the MSK wounded. but first and foremost made Himmler very irate. However, it was a statement by the Kriegsmarine that the found documents in the Berlin offices were ripe of occultism, and when eventually presented to the Fuhrer for the inevitable butt of heads between the Kriegsmarine and the SS in the Reichskanzlei. The occultism and lack of focus of the research seemingly only strengthened the SS, but not the Reich. This fact swayed the Fuhrer's favor in the direction of the Kriegsmarine, with the clear vision to strengthen the Wehrmacht, and the promise to cooperate with the Heer and Luftwaffe on the matter. The research responsibility was now shifted to the Erprobungskommando für Kriegsschiff Neubauten, located in Danzig. Danzig was also the place where the Kriegsmarine finally got their hands on the remains of the destroyed Mistrust, captured all the way back in October. They also found out the SS had gotten its hands on one of the devices around the Hell Peninsula, and many, many files of research notes. Sources say Admiral Scheer, who had accompanied the troops, was over the moon. Reports also state that there were plans made to actually continue weather control and ensure a successful invasion of France, but also to help Kriegsmarine endeavors along the northern coast of the Soviet Union into the newly established Basis Nord. With this research in new hands, only the future would tell what the possibilities were. However, it wasn't all roses and sunshine in Berlin for the Kriegsmarine. The recent failures to break out into the Atlantic and the humiliating defeats around Helgoland, as well as earlier failures in the war against the Allies, meant the Reichskanzlei was seriously considering relieving Admiral Raeder from supreme command of the Kriegsmarine. A related message was sent to the Oberkommando der Marine stating, quote, "Germany was at war, and an unexpected hostile force appeared. But all of that was no reason to deviate from the reliable, bureaucratic ways," end quote. Meanwhile, outside the Reich, with Britain and France supporting Italy's bid to drag Yugoslavia into the Balkan Neutrality Pact, Germany had to take extraordinary steps of deterrence. Forces along the Hungarian border were put into a state of readiness, and a diplomatic note was handed by the German embassy in Belgrade to the king that any endorsement of that neutrality pact with Italy would have immediate consequences. In other news, U-47 was reported missing in action after her last communication had been several months ago, and because of the sudden, harsh weather, Reichssportführer von Schemo and Austin announced the football season 1939/1940 had been prolonged and the final round pushed into May. Furthermore, Germany proceeded to conduct a limited, mostly submarine-based warfare against the Allies. HMS Exmouth was confirmed sunk by U-22 off the English coast, and not all convoy losses in the Atlantic could be attributed to the Morgana anymore. The war was still going on, and Germany wanted to make sure the Allies understood that. And with that concludes the League of Nations War Report for the 4th week of January. While it's not great to hear that power struggles still continue in and amongst our united front, it's quite refreshing to see that the Morgana haven't been forgotten about, and that action was taken when opportunity presented. However, there are still more worrying signs that more is to come from our foreign invaders. As a word of advice to the nations, it would be best to keep an extra eye open to areas both current and neglected, as something may be lurking on the horizon. And as a reminder to all captains and citizens alike that this League of Nations broadcast is intended on keeping you informed about the unified war effort against the Morgana, but we can only do so with your support and the efforts of the world's nations continuing to fight against the invaders. The nations need your help, and yours alone, as you, dear listener, have the power to help change the tide in our favor. And what might that be, you might ask? Well, that's by purchasing some war bonds, of course. War bonds are the best way to support the war effort, as your funds create more munitions, rifles, and supply to keep our fighting men and women well armed as they drive out the foreign invaders from our homes. But that's not all. In return, you get prestige, which you captains can utilize in the form of more bunks, storage, and harbor space to fuel your own war efforts. And for those of you who prefer something to boost morale, you're in luck, as you can utilize that prestige to gift either you or that special someone you know some new formal dress wear, or even a fun historically themed costume if that's more your style. Just drop by your local League of Nations sponsored tailor to see what's available. Thank you for listening, and may you have smooth seas.